The taste of blood flooded my mouth as I bit down on my tongue, trying to keep the words from spilling out. My scholarship letter sat crumpled on the kitchen table between us, and in the harsh fluorescent light, I watched my father's face twist with that familiar expression of disgust. The paper that represented my future, my escape, my proof that I was worth something, reduced to nothing more than garbage in his eyes. "Full ride to Stanford," he sneered, picking up the letter like it was contaminated. "Computer science. You think you're some kind of genius now, don't you?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the letter, my 17-year-old heart hammering against my ribs. "Dad, this is good news. This means I can go to college without—" "Without what? Without me?" Richard Reyes stood up from his chair, his shadow falling across the table like a dark omen. "You think you're better than this family? Better than the man who put food on this table while you sat around reading your little books?" The kitchen felt impossibly small suddenly, the walls pressing in as my father's voice rose. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Chen from next door watering her garden, living her peaceful life while mine crumbled in real time. I'd practiced this moment for weeks, imagining how proud he might be, how maybe, just maybe, this achievement would finally earn me a place in his heart. "I never said I was better," I whispered, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. I just thought you'd be happy that I—" "Happy?" He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You want me to be happy that my daughter thinks she's too good for honest work? That she's chasing fantasies instead of growing up and facing reality?" I watched him pace the small kitchen, his work boots heavy against the linoleum. Richard Reyes, 45 years old, 23 years at Morrison & Associates Construction Supply Company, middle management for the past decade. The same man who used to tell me bedtime stories about knights and dragons before Mom was still alive, before grief turned him into the stranger wearing my father's face. "It's not a fantasy," I said, standing up despite my legs feeling like water. "The scholarship is real. Stanford is real. I have a 4.2 GPA. I scored in the 99th percentile on my SATs. I've been coding since I was 12. "Coding." He spat the word like it tasted bitter. "Playing with computers, while other girls your age are learning practical skills. You know what's going to happen when you get to that fancy school? They're going to chew you up and spit you out. Rich kids with real connections, real money, real futures. And you'll come crawling back here, tail between your legs, finally understanding what I've been trying to tell you all along." The words hit me like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. This was Richard's specialty, not just telling me I was worthless, but explaining exactly why in excruciating detail. "Mom believed in me," I said quietly, immediately regretting the words. His face went white, then red, the veins in his temples pulsing. "Don't you dare bring your mother into this. Carmen is gone, Elena. Gone, and she's not coming back to save you from the real world." "She would have been proud of this scholarship," I continued, my voice growing stronger even as tears burned behind my eyes. "She would have celebrated with me instead of tearing me down." "Your mother was a dreamer too," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Look where it got her, dead at 38 because she couldn't accept that life isn't a fairy tale." The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car door slammed. Life continued outside while mine imploded in this kitchen that still smelled like her perfume sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep. "You'll never be anything, Elena," he said finally, each word deliberately chosen, carefully aimed. "You're weak. You're soft. You live in your head instead of the real world. And that fancy school is going to teach you what I've been trying to tell you your whole life. You don't have what it takes." I looked at my father, really looked at him, and for the first time in my 17 years, I saw him clearly. Not as the giant who had shaped my world through fear and disappointment, but as a broken man taking out his own failures on the daughter who reminded him too much of the woman he'd lost. You're wrong, I said, my voice steady now, and I'm going to prove it. I picked up the scholarship letter, smoothing out the wrinkles his anger had created. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Something had shifted inside me, like a switch flipping from off to on. The girl who had walked into this kitchen hoping for approval was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone with nothing left to lose. "Where do you think you're going?" he called as I headed for the door. I turned back one last time, memorizing his face, the kitchen, the house where my mother had sung lullabies and where my dreams had been systematically murdered. To become everything you said I'd never be. The door slammed behind me with a finality that echoed through my bones. I would never sleep in that house again. The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour diner buzzed overhead as I stared at my reflection in the black coffee, watching the cream swirl in patterns that reminded me of storm clouds. 3 months since I'd walked out of my father's house. 2 jobs keeping me afloat, and every night I fell asleep to the sound of Richard's voice echoing in my head. "You'll never be anything." "You look like hell," Maya Cruz said, sliding into the booth across from me. Her law textbooks hit the table with a thud that made the other late-night customers look up from their own struggles. "When's the last time you slept more than 4 hours?" "Sleep is a luxury," I muttered, but I was grateful for her presence. Maya was the only person from my old life who still cared enough to check on me. We'd been friends since middle school, bonded by our shared experience of disappointing parents and big dreams that seemed impossible from where we sat. "Stanford orientation is in 2 weeks," she continued, stirring sugar into her coffee. "You should be excited. Instead, you look like you're preparing for war." She wasn't wrong. Between my morning shift at the campus bookstore and evening hours coding freelance projects, I barely had time to think, let alone feel excited. But that was the point. Thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to hearing my father's voice telling me I wasn't good enough. "I had another idea crash and burn yesterday," I admitted, pulling out my laptop to show her the programming project that had consumed the last 3 weeks of my life. The app was supposed to help small businesses manage inventory. Spent every free minute on it, thought it could actually make some money. Maya leaned forward, studying the code on my screen. Despite being pre-law, she'd picked up enough programming knowledge to follow my projects. "What happened?" "Turns out there are already 12 apps that do the same thing. All of them better funded and better connected." I closed the laptop with more force than necessary. I'm competing against teams of developers with venture capital backing, while I'm coding on a 5-year-old laptop between shifts at a bookstore. "So you'll try again," she said simply. "That's what you do, Elena. You get knocked down, you get back up." Maybe my father was right. Maybe I am just chasing fantasies. Maya's expression hardened. I'd made a mistake mentioning Richard. She'd been there the night I'd shown up at her dorm room with a backpack and $17. Too proud to explain exactly what had happened, but unable to hide the pain. "Your father," she said carefully, "is a bitter man who gave up on his dreams and decided to poison yours too. Don't you dare let him win by giving up on yourself." Before I could respond, a man in an expensive suit approached our table. Mid-50s, silver at his temples, carrying himself with the kind of confidence that came from making decisions that affected other people's lives. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cultured, precise. "I couldn't help overhear your conversation about app development. I'm Marcus Velez." He handed me a business card that felt substantial between my fingers. "CEO of Velez Dynamics. Would you mind if I joined you for a moment?" I glanced at Maya, who raised an eyebrow but gestured to the empty seat beside her. Marcus sat down, studying me with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "You said your app crashed because of competition. Tell me about the technical specifications, not the business model. I want to know how you built it." For the next 20 minutes, I found myself explaining architecture decisions, database optimization, user interface design. Marcus asked sharp questions, pushing me on choices I'd made, alternatives I'd considered. It felt like the most intense job interview of my life, conducted in a diner at midnight. "Impressive," he said finally. "You are self-taught?" "Mostly. Some online courses, lots of trial and error." I hesitated, but then decided honesty couldn't hurt worse than my current situation. "I don't have a computer science degree yet. Starting at Stanford in 2 weeks, but I've been coding since I was 12. "Stanford," Marcus repeated, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Excellent program. But you know what they won't teach you there?" "What?" "How to fail fast and recover faster. How to see opportunity in rejection. How to build something from nothing when everyone tells you it's impossible." He stood up, smoothing down his suit jacket. "I'd like to offer you a part-time position, 20 hours a week, flexible around your class schedule, junior developer role, but with direct access to me and my senior team." My heart stopped. This felt too good to be real, like one of those dreams where you win the lottery only to wake up broke. "What's the catch?" Maya asked, ever the future lawyer. Marcus smiled wider. "No catch. Just a man who recognizes talent when he sees it, and who remembers what it was like to be young and hungry and tired of people telling her what she couldn't do." He looked directly at me. "Your app failed because you were solving the right problem with the wrong resources. Come work for me, and I'll show you how to match your skills with the right opportunities." After he left, Maya and I sat in silence for several minutes. The diner felt different now, like the air itself had shifted. The fluorescent lights seemed less harsh, the coffee less bitter. "This could change everything," Maya said quietly. I nodded, but something inside me remained cautious. Too many disappointments had taught me not to trust good fortune. If it's real, if he actually means it, there's only one way to find out. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "But, Elena, when this works out, and I believe it will, don't forget why you're doing it. It's not about proving your father wrong. It's about proving yourself right." Later that night, alone in my studio apartment, I called the number on Marcus Velez's card. His assistant answered on the second ring, professional but warm, and within minutes I had an appointment scheduled for the following day. As I hung up the phone, I caught sight of my reflection in the dark window. For the first time in months, the face looking back at me didn't look defeated. Tired, yes. Scared, definitely. But not defeated. Richard's voice still echoed in my head, but tonight it felt more distant, like a radio station fading out as you drive away from the city. "You'll never be anything," I whispered to my reflection. "We'll see about that." Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The taste of victory was sweeter than I'd imagined it would be, but it came with an aftertaste of emptiness that I hadn't expected. I stood in the conference room of Velez Dynamics, watching Marcus's face as he reviewed the quarterly numbers on his tablet, the weight of my success pressing down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. "The Hartwell Industries contract," Marcus said, looking up at me with something that might have been pride. $12.7 million over 3 years, the biggest deal in company history. He set down the tablet and leaned back in his leather chair. "You've been with us 18 months, Elena. How did you see the opportunity that our senior sales team missed?" I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Even now, even with undeniable proof of my capabilities, Richard's voice whispered in my head, "Lucky break, won't last. You're not really good enough." I spent time actually listening to their frustrations instead of trying to sell them what we thought they needed. Their legacy system was hemorrhaging money on inefficiencies that our integration protocol could fix. But they'd been burned by 3 previous vendors who overpromised and underdelivered. "So you underpromised and overdelivered," Marcus nodded. "Classic strategy, but executing it requires understanding both the technical and emotional components of the sale.
The technical part, that's your programming background. But the emotional intelligence, that comes from somewhere deeper. What drives you, Elena? The question hit me like a physical blow. I could feel my pulse quickening, that familiar fight or flight response that kicked in whenever someone got too close to the wound that still hadn't healed. I want to prove that I can be successful, I said carefully. The words true, but incomplete. To whom? The silence stretched between us like a tightrope. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city bustled with people who weren't dissecting their motivations in corporate conference rooms. People who probably hadn't spent the last 2 years working 70-hour weeks, pushing themselves to the edge of exhaustion, all to silence a voice that lived permanently in their heads. To myself, I lied. Marcus's expression told me he didn't believe me, but he didn't push. That was one of the things I'd learned to appreciate about my mentor in the past year and a half. He understood the difference between guidance and intrusion. He said, "Success without purpose is just elaborate procrastination. I've seen brilliant people achieve everything they thought they wanted, only to discover that they were solving the wrong problem all along." My phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Coffee tonight? You've been avoiding me again." She was right, of course. I had been avoiding her. Maya had a way of seeing through my carefully constructed professional persona, of asking the questions that made me consider
Uncomfortable. Like why I still checked my father's LinkedIn profile every few weeks, or why I'd never once reached out to him despite my growing success. "The Hartwell deal," I said, changing the subject back to safer ground. "It positions us well for the Morrison Industries contract next quarter, doesn't it?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Morrison Industries. That's interesting. You've mentioned them before." Had I? The name had slipped out before I could stop it, and now I could feel heat creeping up my neck. Morrison and Associates Construction Supply Company. The same company where my father had spent the last 23 years of his life grinding away in middle management, convinced that his small corner of the corporate world was the extent of his universe. "They're a potential client," I said carefully. "Mid-size construction supply company, family-owned for 3 generations, but they've been struggling with digital transformation. Their inventory management system is from the 1990s. "You've done your research," Marcus observed. "When did you first become interested in them?" The honest answer was that I'd been researching Morrison Industries obsessively for months, not as a business opportunity, but as a way to peer into my father's world from the outside. I knew their quarterly earnings, their supply chain partners, their major clients. I knew that they'd lost 2 significant contracts in the past year due to delivery delays caused by their outdated systems. I also knew that Richard Reyes, inventory coordination supervisor, had been passed over for promotion to operations manager twice in the past 18 months. "Market research," I said instead. "They fit our target client profile perfectly." That evening, I met Maya at our usual spot, the same diner where I'd first met Marcus, though now I could afford to order more than just coffee. She was already waiting in our booth, case files spread across the table, looking every inch the successful law student she had become. "You look tired," she said without preamble, the same greeting she'd been giving me for months. "I'm fine," I replied aromatically, sliding into the seat across from her. "No, you're not." She closed her files and gave me her full attention. "You landed the biggest deal in your company's history. Your mentor is fast-tracking you toward a senior position. You're 21 years old and already earning more money than most people see in a lifetime. You should be celebrating. Instead, you look like someone who's been sentenced to success instead of achieving it." The accuracy of her observation hit me like a punch to the solar plexus. I'd been waiting for this moment. The moment when my accomplishments would finally quiet the voice in my head, when I'd finally feel worthy of the space I occupied in the world. Instead, each success felt hollow, like checking items off a list that someone else had written. What if it's not enough? The words came out before I could stop them. What if I keep climbing and it's never enough to matter? Enough for what? For whom? Maya leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "Elena, you haven't spoken to your father in almost 3 years. You've built an entire career, changed your whole life, become someone completely different from the scared teenager who left home. But you're still living your life in reaction to him.
I'm not. You are. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand, her touch grounding me. Every time you work late, every time you push yourself past exhaustion, every time you achieve something amazing and feel empty instead of proud, you're still that 17-year-old girl trying to prove to Richard Reyes that he was wrong. Tears stung my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I hadn't cried in years, had trained myself out of that particular vulnerability. But Maya's words had found their target with surgical precision. "I just want him to see," I whispered. "I want him to know that he was wrong about me." "And then what?" she asked gently. "Let's say tomorrow he calls you up and says, 'Elena, I was wrong. You're successful and talented and I'm proud of you.' Then what? Does that fix the damage? Does that give you back the childhood where you believed in yourself instead of fighting for scraps of approval?" I couldn't answer because I didn't know. The fantasy of my father's recognition had sustained me for so long that I'd never looked beyond it to see what came next. "The thing about revenge," Maya continued, "is that it only works if the other person cares enough to be hurt by it. What if your father sees your success and doesn't care? What if he's so wrapped up in his own problems that your achievements don't even register? Then you've built your entire life around impressing someone who isn't even paying attention."
But for the first time, I wasn't looking at them as a potential client. I was looking at them as the place where my father spent 40 hours a week, the source of his identity and what little self-worth he'd managed to salvage from his own disappointed dreams. Maya was right. I was still living in reaction to him, still measuring my worth by his standards, even as I surpassed them. But knowing that didn't make it easier to stop. The voice in my head that sounded like Richard Reyes had become part of my internal architecture, as fundamental to my functioning as my heartbeat. I closed the laptop and went to bed, but sleep was elusive. In the darkness, I could hear my mother's voice from a memory so distant it felt like someone else's dream. "Success isn't about proving other people wrong, Miha. It's about proving yourself right." But how do you prove yourself right when you're not sure who you are without the thing you're fighting against? The taste of expensive coffee turned bitter in my mouth as I stared across the conference table at the man who had shaped every insecurity I'd ever carried. 25 years old now, sitting in a boardroom on the 40th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, and suddenly I was 17 again, crumpling under the weight of his disapproval. Richard Reyes sat 3 seats down from me, completely oblivious to my presence, his attention focused on the presentation Marcus was giving about the Morrison Industries acquisition. My father looked older, grayer around the temples, but his posture still carried that familiar arrogance, the way he held his shoulders that said he belonged in rooms like this, even when everything about his cheap suit and nervous energy suggested otherwise. "As you can see," Marcus continued, clicking through slides that detailed Morrison's financial struggles, "their inventory management systems are catastrophically outdated. They're hemorrhaging money on inefficiencies that a company their size simply cannot afford in today's market." I forced myself to breathe, to maintain the professional composure I'd spent years perfecting. But inside, my pulse hammered against my ribs like a caged animal. This was supposed to be a routine client meeting, a chance to pitch our services to a mid-tier construction supply company. I hadn't expected him to be here. "The real opportunity," I heard myself saying, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head, "is in their supply chain integration. Morrison Industries is still using paper-based tracking for inventory transfers. We're talking about a system that predates the internet." Richard's head turned toward me for the first time, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place my voice. I watched recognition flicker across his features, a momentary confusion, then disbelief, then something that might have been fear. "Elena?" The name came out as barely a whisper. The room fell silent. Marcus glanced between us, his eyebrows raised in a question I wasn't ready to answer. The other Morrison executives looked confused, sensing undercurrents they couldn't understand. "Mr. Reyes?" I said formally, extending my hand across the table. "It's been a while." He stared at my hand for a long moment before taking it,
his palm damp with sweat. What are you doing here? I work for Vila's Dynamics. I'm the lead consultant on potential technology integrations for mid-market companies. I replied as if the past 8 years of radio silence between us was perfectly normal. I could see him processing this information, trying to reconcile the daughter who had stormed out of his house with a crumpled scholarship letter with the woman in the expensive suit sitting across from him in a corporate boardroom. The math didn't compute in his worldview, where I was supposed to have failed, supposed to have come crawling back. "You mean to tell me," said James Morrison, the company's aging CEO, "that you two know each other?" "Mr. Reyes is my father," I said simply, watching Richard flinch at the word father as if it carried a physical weight. The meeting continued, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Richard seemed to shrink in his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating as he watched me present technical solutions with the kind of authority he never believed I could possess. Every question I answered, every insight I offered, was proof of his fundamental miscalculation about who I was and what I was capable of becoming. The implementation timeline, Marcus was saying, would be approximately 6 months for full integration, with measurable improvements beginning within the first quarter. "And the cost?" James Morrison asked, though his attention kept drifting between me and Richard, clearly fascinated by this unexpected family drama playing out in his boardroom. $2.4 million over 3 years. But the efficiency savings alone should offset that investment within 18 months. You're currently losing approximately $400,000 annually to inventory tracking errors and supply chain delays. I could feel Richard's eyes on me as I spoke, but I didn't look at him directly. This wasn't about him anymore. This was business. Or so I told myself. The truth was more complicated, messier. Every word I spoke was simultaneously a professional presentation and a personal vindication. Proof delivered directly to the man who had told me I'd never amount to anything.
After the meeting, as the Morrison executives filed out to discuss our proposal, Richard lingered behind. Marcus, reading the room with his usual perceptiveness, excused himself, leaving us alone in the conference room with its panoramic view of the city where I had built my new life. 8 years, Richard said finally, his voice rougher than I remembered. 8 years without a word. "You made it clear I wasn't welcome," I replied, straightening my blazer to give my hands something to do. I took the hint. I never said you weren't welcome to come home. I turned to face him fully for the first time, studying the man who had once seemed like a giant to me. He looked smaller now, diminished by age and circumstance, but also by the obvious realization that the narrative he'd constructed about my inevitable failure was crumbling around him. "You told me I'd never be anything," I said quietly, that I was weak, that I was chasing fantasies, that the real world would chew me up and spit me out. Did you expect me to come home and thank you for the encouragement? His face flushed red, the same color it used to turn when his anger got the better of him. "I was trying to prepare you for disappointment. The world is hard, Elena, harder than your mother ever let you understand." "Don't bring her into this," I snapped, feeling 8 years of careful emotional control threatening to crack. "Mom believed in me. She would have been proud of what I've accomplished." "Your mother is dead," he said bluntly, the words hitting me like a slap. "She's not here to see anything. And you look at me like I'm some kind of monster for trying to teach you that life doesn't hand out participation trophies." I stared at him, this man who had never learned the difference between preparing someone for challenge and crushing their spirit entirely. He genuinely believed he'd been protecting me, saving me from the disappointment he'd never recovered from himself. "You weren't preparing me," I said finally. "You were projecting your own failures onto me because you couldn't handle the possibility that I might succeed where you hadn't." The silence that followed was thick with 8 years of unspoken resentment. Through the conference room windows, the city sprawled beneath us, full of people living their lives without the baggage that connected us to each other through shared DNA and shared damage. "Morrison Industries," I said, changing the subject because the personal conversation was leading nowhere productive. "How long have you been with them?" 23 years next month, he replied, his voice carrying a note of pride that seemed almost pathetic given the context. Inventory coordination supervisor. I've been running the day-to-day operations for their main warehouse. 23 years. The same job, the same title, the same small corner of a struggling company. I thought about my trajectory. 8 years from homeless teenager to lead consultant, from crumpled scholarship letter to Manhattan boardroom. We'd been living parallel lives in completely different dimensions. They're lucky to have your experience, I said, and meant it. Whatever else Richard Reyes was, he'd always been a hard worker. That much I remembered and respected. Are they going to accept your proposal? He asked. I considered the question carefully. From a business perspective, Morrison Industries needed what we were offering. Their systems were antiquated, their efficiency ratings were abysmal, and their competition was eating their market share. But accepting our proposal would mean months of working together, of seeing each other regularly, of navigating the minefield of our relationship while trying to maintain professional boundaries. Probably, I said. It's a good deal for them. And for you? I met his eyes directly. For Vila's Dynamics, yes, it's a significant contract. What I didn't say was that this felt like fate intervening, offering me a chance to prove something I thought I'd already proven to myself. The opportunity to work directly with his company, to demonstrate my competence in his professional world, to finally close the loop on the conversation that had started with a scholarship letter and his crushing dismissal of my potential. I should go, Richard said, gathering his papers with hands that trembled slightly. I need to report back to James about the meeting. He paused at the door, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You did well in there, the presentation, I mean. Very professional. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't acknowledgement of how wrong he had been, but it was the closest thing to praise I'd ever received from him, and I hate how much that tiny scrap of approval still meant to me. After he left, I stood alone in the conference room, looking out at the city that had become my kingdom. 8 years of building myself up, of proving my worth, of becoming the woman he said I could never be. And now, unexpectedly, I had the chance to prove it directly to him.
The question was, what did I really want to prove? And what was I willing to risk to prove it? The taste of ambition had turned metallic in my mouth as I stared at the acquisition documents spread across my desk at 3 a.m. The numbers swam before my tired eyes, but the bottom line was crystal clear. Morrison Industries was hemorrhaging money faster than their aging infrastructure could support, and I was about to become their lifeline. Or their executioner. You've been here all night again, Maya said from the doorway of my office, her voice carrying that familiar note of concern that had become the soundtrack to our friendship. She set down 2 cups of coffee and settled into the chair across from my desk, studying the financial reports with the analytical eyes she'd honed in law school. Morrison's board meeting is in 6 hours, I replied, not looking up from the spreadsheets that had consumed my life for the past 3 weeks. Marcus wants the acquisition proposal finalized before we present. Acquisition? Maya leaned forward, her eyebrows raised. I thought this was a consulting contract. Systems integration, efficiency improvements. That's what you told me. I finally met her eyes, and she must have seen something there that made her sit back in her chair. 3 weeks of research had revealed what I'd suspected from the moment I'd sat across from Richard in that conference room. Morrison Industries wasn't just struggling. They were dying. Slowly, quietly, but inevitably. The consulting contract was phase 1, I said carefully. Get inside, understand their systems, identify the real scope of their problems. Phase 2, I gestured to the documents covering my desk. Phase 2 is a complete buyout. Maya was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Outside my office windows, the city was still dark, but I could see the first hints of dawn creeping across the horizon. Another sleepless night in service of a plan that had taken on a life of its own. Elena, she said finally, her voice gentle but firm, what are you really doing here? The question I'd been avoiding, even in my own head. The rational answer was business. Morrison Industries represented a solid investment opportunity, a chance for Velez Dynamics to expand into the construction supply sector. The systems upgrade alone would save them millions annually, and under proper management, the company could be profitable within 2 years. But rationality was a thin veneer over the molten core of motivation that actually drove me. This wasn't just about business. This was about power. This was about control. This was about placing myself in a position where Richard Reyes would have to acknowledge not just my success, but my authority over his professional fate. "I'm building something," I said instead. "Marcus has been talking about succession planning, about expanding Velez Dynamics beyond our current scope. This acquisition fits perfectly into that vision." "That's what you're telling Marcus," Maya observed. "What are you telling yourself?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city that never truly slept. 26 years old, and I commanded a salary that would have been fantasy money to the teenager who left home with nothing but wounded pride and a college acceptance letter. I had respect, influence, a mentor who treated me like the daughter he'd never had. By any objective measure, I'd won. So why did victory feel so hollow? "Morrison Industries employs 437 people," I said, deflecting Maya's question with facts and figures. "Their quarterly revenue has declined 18% over the past 2 years. Without significant capital investment and systems modernization, they'll be bankrupt within 18 months. And with your capital investment and systems modernization, profitable within 2 years, potentially a market leader within 5. Maya joined me at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "That's not what I'm asking, and you know it. I'm asking about your father." The word hit me like a physical blow, as it always did. Father. As if the biological connection meant something more than shared DNA and mutual disappointment. As if 26 years of damage could be summarized in such a simple term. "He'll be an employee," I said carefully. "The same as everyone else. An employee reporting to his daughter, the daughter he told would never amount to anything. Alina, this isn't business. This is revenge. And revenge has a way of consuming the person seeking it more than the person it's aimed at." I wanted to argue with her, to insist that my motivations were purely professional, but Maya had known me too long, had seen me through too many sleepless nights and hollow victories. She understood the architecture of my ambition better than I did sometimes. "What if it is revenge?" I asked finally. "What if I want him to see exactly how wrong he was about me? What if I want him to understand that his opinion of my potential was less than worthless?" "Then you'll get your revenge," she said quietly. "And then what? After you've proved your point, after you've demonstrated your power over him, what comes next? Do you think humiliating him
Will heal the damage he did? Do you think making him acknowledge your success will give you back the childhood where you believed in yourself?" Her questions hung in the air like accusations. Dawn was breaking over the city now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of mornings when my mother was still alive, when the world still held the possibility of unconditional love. "I need to finish the proposal," I said, returning to my desk. Maya didn't leave immediately. She stood by the window for several more minutes, and I could feel her watching me work. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. "I love you, Elena. You're my best friend, and I've watched you build an incredible life from nothing. But I'm scared that you're about to throw it all away chasing something that can't be caught." After she left, I worked in silence until Marcus arrived at 7. His usual, perfectly pressed suit and sharp smile, masking whatever concerns he might have had about my recent obsession with the Morrison acquisition. "The numbers look solid," he said, reviewing my proposal with the speed-reading skills that had made him a legend in corporate circles. "ROI projections are conservative, market analysis is thorough. This could be exactly the kind of expansion opportunity we've been looking for." "There's one complication," I said, the words coming out before I could reconsider them. Marcus looked up from the documents, his expression sharpening. "What kind of complication?" "Richard Reyes, their inventory coordination supervisor. He's my father." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus set down the proposal and leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same intensity he usually reserved for balance sheets and market projections. "Your father," he repeated slowly. "The man you've never mentioned in 3 years of working together."
We're estranged, I said, as if that simple word could encompass 8 years of silence and 26 years of complicated damage. And you want to buy his company. I want to buy a company that represents a solid investment opportunity. The fact that he works there is coincidental. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't his usual expression of approval. This smile was sadder, more knowing, the look of a man who'd lived long enough to recognize the dangerous intersection of business and personal vendetta. "Elena," he said carefully, "I've watched you grow from a brilliant but angry young woman into one of the most capable executives I've ever worked with. Your technical skills are exceptional, your strategic thinking is sophisticated, and your ability to see opportunities others miss has made this company millions of dollars. But I'm scared that you're about to throw it all away chasing something that can't be caught." I thought about Maya's similar warnings, about the pattern of people I trusted, trying to talk me out of the one thing that felt like it could finally heal the wound Richard had left in me. What if this isn't about revenge? What if this is about justice? About ensuring that incompetence and cruelty don't go unrewarded? "Then you're lying to yourself," Marcus said bluntly. "And that's the most dangerous kind of lie there is." Despite his concerns, Marcus approved the acquisition proposal. Morrison Industries board voted to accept our offer within a week. The paperwork was filed, the contracts were signed, and suddenly I found myself the owner of the company where my father had spent the last 23 years of his life. Richard had no idea, of course. The acquisition was structured through multiple holding companies, and the new ownership wouldn't be announced to employees until after the transition period was complete. For now, he was still working for James Morrison, still filing his inventory reports, still believing that his small corner of the corporate world was stable and secure. But I knew. And that knowledge sat in my chest like a bomb with a timer I controlled, waiting for the moment when I would finally detonate 8 years of silence and prove, once and for all, that his judgment of my potential had been catastrophically wrong. The taste of that future victory was intoxicating. It was also terrifying. The taste of anticipation was electric on my tongue as I walked into the Morrison Industries boardroom for the first time as its owner. 6 months of careful planning had led to this moment. The official announcement of the ownership transition, the revelation that would shift the entire foundation of my father's world. My reflection in the polished conference table saw a woman
who looked nothing like the 17-year-old girl who had stormed out of her childhood home with a crumpled scholarship letter. "Ladies and gentlemen," James Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of his 73 years and 45 years of running the family business, "I'd like to introduce the new CEO of Morrison Industries, Elena Reyes of Velez Dynamics." The silence that followed was pregnant with confusion and recognition. 23 employees sat around the table, including department heads, senior supervisors, and 3 seats from the head of the table, my father. Richard's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so devastating. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally a kind of pale shock that made him look older than his 53 years. "Reyes," whispered Patricia Chen from accounting, her voice barely audible. "Are you related to—" "Richard is my father," I said simply, my voice carrying across the room with the kind of authority I'd spent years learning to project. "But I want to assure everyone that this acquisition is based purely on business considerations. Morrison Industries is a solid company with tremendous potential that's been held back by outdated systems and management practices." I could feel Richard's eyes boring into me, but I didn't look at him directly. This moment was too important to compromise with emotion or sentimentality. I'd rehearsed this presentation dozens of times, crafted every word to project competence and vision while subtly undermining the status quo that had allowed the company to stagnate. Our first priority, I clicked through slides that detailed efficiency improvements and modernization plans, is implementing the systems integration we've been developing over the past 6 months.
Secondary priorities include restructuring management hierarchies to reward performance over tenure and identifying redundancies in our current staffing model. That last phrase sent a ripple of anxiety through the room. Redundancies meant layoffs, meant people losing jobs they'd held for years or even decades. I watched faces tighten with worry, except for Richard's face, which had gone completely blank. He was in shock, processing the impossible reality that his daughter, the daughter he'd dismissed as weak and impractical, now controlled his professional fate. "What about existing management?" asked Bill Rodriguez from operations, his voice carefully neutral. "Will there be changes to the current structure?" I smiled, the expression feeling both natural and calculated. Performance evaluations will be conducted for all employees, including management. Positions will be retained based on merit, contribution to company goals, and adaptability to our new operational model. Finally, I allowed myself to look directly at Richard. He was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something closer to fear. For the first time in my life, I held power over the man who had shaped every insecurity I'd ever carried. "Mr. Reyes," I said formally, addressing him as if he were any other employee, "as inventory coordination supervisor, you'll be working directly with our new systems integration team. I trust that won't be a problem?" The formality of it was deliberate, a public demonstration that our personal relationship would not affect business decisions. But everyone in the room could feel the undercurrent, the weight of history and family drama playing out in corporate terminology. "No problem at all," he managed, his voice hoarse. I'm sure we'll work well together." After the meeting, employees filed out in clusters, whispering among themselves about the unexpected family connection and what it might mean for their jobs. I lingered behind, organizing my presentation materials with deliberate slowness, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Richard approached my chair with the careful movements of a man walking through a minefield. "Elena," he said quietly, "can we talk privately?" I looked up at him, this man who had loomed so large in my nightmares and fantasies, and felt a strange disconnection from the anger that had driven me for so many years. In the harsh fluorescent light of the conference room, he looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by time and the circumstance. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the chair beside me. "Have a seat." He sat down heavily, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "I don't understand how this happened, when did you become someone who could buy companies?" 8 years of hard work, I replied simply. 8 years of building something instead of tearing other people down. He flinched at the implied criticism, but didn't argue. "I had no idea you were successful. I thought, after you left home, I thought you'd come back eventually, when you were ready to be practical about your future." I was practical. I got the education you said was worthless, built the career you said was impossible, and developed the skills you said I'd never have. The only thing I didn't do was fail like you expected me to. The words hung between us like a blade. Richard's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment I could see past his arrogance to the broken man underneath, someone who had projected his
Own failures onto his daughter because he couldn't bear the possibility that I might succeed where he had struggled. "You bought my company," he said, the words barely a whisper. "You bought the place where I've worked for 23 years just to prove a point?" "I bought a company that was underperforming and needed capital investment," I corrected. "The fact that you work here is relevant, but not determinative." "Don't lie to me, Elena. Not now." His voice carried a note of desperation that I'd never heard before. "This is about what I said when you left, about what I called you. You want me to suffer the way you suffered?" The accusation hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Was this about revenge? About making him feel as powerless as he'd made me feel all those years ago? The honest answer was complicated,
layered with 8 years of success that had never quite filled the hole his words had left in me. "I want you to see," I said finally. "I want you to understand that your opinion of my potential was worth exactly nothing, that the daughter you dismissed as weak and impractical is now in a position to determine your professional future." "And then what?" he asked, echoing Maya's question from months earlier. "After I see, after I understand, what happens then?" I didn't have an answer for that question because I'd spent so much energy getting to this moment that I'd never thought seriously about what came after. The victory was supposed to feel more complete, more satisfying. Instead, it felt hollow, like winning an argument with someone who was no longer worth arguing with. That night, I called Maya. "So," she said, without preamble, "how does it feel to own your father's life?" "Complicated," I admitted. "That's because revenge is complicated. It never delivers what it promises, and it always costs more than you expect to pay." I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. The machinery of power was already in motion, and Richard Reyes was about to discover just how thoroughly his daughter had learned the lessons he never intended to teach. The taste of absolute power was bitter in my mouth as I watched my father's hands shake while signing the new employment contract. 3 weeks had passed since the boardroom revelation, and I had spent every day since then methodically dismantling the professional identity Richard Reyes had built for 23 years. "Facilities maintenance," he read aloud, his voice hollow. "Building custodian? Starting Monday?" The uniform lay between us on his former desk. Navy blue shirt, matching pants, a name tag that read Richard in block letters. No last name, no title, just another anonymous worker in a building where he'd once supervised inventory for an entire warehouse complex. "I don't understand," he said, looking up at me with eyes that had lost their familiar arrogance. "My performance evaluations have always been satisfactory. I know this company better than anyone. I've been here for 23 years. Yes, I'm aware, but knowing a company and performing effectively are different things. Your department had the highest error rate in the building, the slowest processing times, and the most customer complaints about delayed shipments." Each fact hit him like a physical blow. I'd memorized every metric, every failure, every small incompetence that had accumulated over his tenure. The research was thorough, clinical, devastating. "This is about revenge. You're punishing me for what happened when you were 17. I leaned back in the chair that had once been his, the chair where he'd sat for nearly a quarter century, believing his small corner of authority made him important. "This is about performance, about accountability, about ensuring that Morrison Industries operates with maximum efficiency."
Efficiency? He laughed, but the sound was broken. "You're making me a janitor, Elena, your own father. Biology doesn't entitle you to preferential treatment," I replied, my voice as cold as I could make it. "If anything, it means you should be held to a higher standard." He stood up slowly, his movements those of an old man, though he was only 53. The uniform hung from his arm like a surrender flag, the physical manifestation of his complete fall from whatever grace he'd imagined he possessed. "Your mother would be ashamed of you," he said quietly. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I felt my carefully constructed composure crack, felt 17 years old again, vulnerable and desperate for approval I'd never receive. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Don't you dare invoke her memory to justify your failures." "Carmen believed in kindness," he continued, ignoring my warning. "She believed in forgiveness, in building people up instead of tearing them down. Look at yourself, Elena. Look at what you've become."
I stood up abruptly, the chair rolling backward into the window. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, oblivious to the destruction happening in this small office. I became everything you said I never could be. Successful, powerful, respected. You became me, he said simply. The worst version of me. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Richard gathered his personal belongings. A coffee mug, a small framed photo of my mother, a desk calendar that had somehow survived 2 decades of corporate restructuring. Such small tokens of a life spent in service to a company that had just discarded him. "When do I start?" he asked. "Monday morning, 6 a.m., report to Bill Rodriguez in maintenance." After he left, I sat alone in his former office, staring at the janitor's uniform he'd left behind on the desk. The fabric felt rough under my fingers, institutional and impersonal. This was what victory looked like, a navy blue shirt and the knowledge that I'd reduced the man who'd raised me to pushing a mop through hallways where he had once walked with purpose. Maya found me there an hour later, still holding the uniform. "Jesus, Elena," she said, taking in the scene. "What have you done?" "What needed to be done," I replied, but the words sounded hollow even to me. "He's 53 years old. You just destroyed his career, his dignity, his entire sense of self. For what? To prove a point? To prove that actions have consequences, that 26 years of cruelty and dismissal don't go unanswered." Maya sat down across from me, her expression a mixture of sadness and disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. "And how do you feel now? Vindicated? Powerful? Complete?" I wanted to lie, to insist that justice had been served and that I felt exactly as satisfied as I'd expected. But the truth was more complicated, messier. The victory felt hollow, like winning a game where the rules had changed while I wasn't paying attention. "I feel like I need him to understand," I said finally. "I need him to know that he was wrong about me." "He knows. He's known since the day you walked into that boardroom and announced you owned his world. But understanding your power and respecting it are different things. You can force him to wear that uniform, to clean floors and empty trash cans, but you can't force him to believe he deserved it." Outside the window, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me of childhood evenings when the world had seemed full of possibility, before disappointment had hardened into resentment, before love had curdled into the need for revenge. "What if this isn't enough?" I asked. "Then nothing will be," Maya replied. "And you'll have to decide whether you want to spend the rest of your life trying to extract apologies from a man who may not be capable of giving them, or whether you want to build something better than the pain he left you with." That night, I went home to my expensive apartment with its view of the city I'd conquered, and I dreamed of my mother. In the dream, she was disappointed in me, her gentle voice asking why I'd chosen to become the very thing I'd spent my childhood fearing. I woke up with tears on my face and the taste of regret in my mouth, wondering if revenge was just another word for becoming the person you swore you'd never be. The taste of memory was sharp and metallic as I stood in the doorway of my childhood home, keys heavy in my hand. 3 months had passed since I'd reduced my father to a janitor, and the house felt like a mausoleum, preserving ghosts I'd spent years trying to escape.
Maya had driven me here, understanding without words that this was something I needed to do but couldn't face alone. She waited in the car while I stepped across the threshold into rooms that still smelled faintly of my mother's perfume, despite her being gone for 14 years. "Hello, Mom," I whispered to the empty living room. Carmen's presence was everywhere. In the soft blue walls she'd painted herself, in the bookshelves filled with the novels she'd read to me,
in the piano that hadn't been touched since the day she died. I could almost hear her voice, gentle and encouraging, telling me bedtime stories about heroes who chose kindness over conquest. The kitchen was exactly as I remembered it, down to the chip in the counter where I dropped a glass when I was 8. This was where Richard had crushed my dreams with his bare hands, where he'd told me I'd never be anything. But it was also where my mother had helped me with homework, where he'd listened to my ideas about computer programs and space exploration with the kind of attention that made a child feel like their thoughts mattered. I found her letters in the bedroom, tucked away in a jewelry box that Richard had apparently never disturbed. Dozens of them, written to me during her final months in the hospital, sealed but never delivered. My hands shook as I opened the first one. My darling Elena, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably hurting more than you know how to handle. I want you to know that you are the most beautiful thing I ever created. Not because you're perfect, but because you're curious and kind and brave enough to dream big dreams. Your father loves you, even though he shows it badly. He scared me, huh? Scared that the world will hurt you the way it hurt him. But fear makes people cruel sometimes, and I'm sorry if his fear has made him cruel to you. The letter blurred as tears filled my eyes. I sank onto her bed, surrounded by the faded scent of lavender and the weight of words I'd never heard. There were 17 more letters, one for each birthday she'd never see, each one filled with encouragement and love and the kind of faith in my potential that Richard had never been able to offer. For your 18th birthday, I hope you're in college now, learning and growing and discovering who you want to become. Remember that success isn't about proving other people wrong. It's about proving yourself right. Don't let anyone, not even your father, convince you that your worth depends on their approval. For your 25th birthday, you're a woman now, making your own choices and building your own life. I hope you've learned to forgive, especially those who hurt you without meaning to. Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for you to free you from carrying their damage forward. For your 27th birthday, if you have children someday, remember that love isn't something you earn through achievement. It's something you give freely, unconditionally, because that's what love is. Break the cycle, mija. Be better than the pain that shaped you. Each letter was a glimpse into the woman I'd lost, the parent who might have helped me navigate my father's disappointment without absorbing it into my bones. By the time I finished reading, the sun had set and Maya was knocking softly on the front door. "How are you doing?" she asked, finding me still surrounded by letters in my mother's bedroom. "She knew," I said. "She knew he would hurt me and she tried to leave me tools to handle it, but I never got them." Maya sat beside me on the bed, reading over my shoulder. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman." I admitted she would hate what I've done to him. She'd be ashamed of who I've become. "Maybe, or maybe she'd understand why you felt like you had to become that person." Maya picked up one of the later letters, scanning the careful handwriting. "But understanding and approving are different things." I told her about Richard's words from our last confrontation, about how he'd said I'd become the worst version of him. The accusation had been eating at me for months, growing heavier with each day I watched him push a mop through hallways where he'd once held authority. "He might be right," Maya said carefully. "You have become like him in some ways, using your power to diminish someone weaker, making them feel worthless to protect your own ego. But there's one crucial difference." "What's that?" "You can choose to stop." That night, I called Marcus for the first time in weeks. Our relationship had grown strained since the Morrison acquisition, his disappointment in my choices creating a distance that felt insurmountable. "Elena," he said, his voice cautious. "How are you?" "I've been better," I admitted. "Marcus, I need to ask you something. When you were building your first company, did you ever do something you knew was wrong because it felt like justice?" The silence stretched long enough that I thought he might hang up. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with memory. "I destroyed a man once," he said. "A business partner who betrayed me, cost me millions, and nearly bankrupted my company. I spent 3 years building a case against him, gathering evidence, planning his downfall. When I finally destroyed him, it felt like the most satisfying moment of my life. And then I realized that revenge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It had consumed 3 years of my life, turned me into someone I didn't recognize, and ultimately gave me nothing but the hollow satisfaction of watching someone else suffer. How did you live with it? By making sure I never did it again, by understanding that the person I hurt most with my need for vengeance was myself. Marcus paused. Elena, it's not too late to choose a different path. Your father is broken, humiliated, probably destroyed. You've proven your point. The question is, what are you going to do with that victory? After I hung up, I sat in my mother's kitchen, surrounded by the ghost of who I used to be and the weight of who I'd become. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Families settling in for the night, living their uncomplicated lives without the burden of inherited damage. I thought about Richard, probably lying awake in his own bedroom, staring at the ceiling and wondering how his life had led to pushing a mop for his daughter. I thought about my mother's letters, about her faith in my potential to be better than the pain that had shaped me. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a different ending to this story, one where victory didn't require anyone's destruction, where strength meant choosing mercy over vengeance, where I could honor my mother's memory by becoming the woman she believed I could be. But wanting to change and knowing how to change were different things. And tomorrow, Richard would still report to work at 6 a.m., still wear the janitor's uniform I'd forced on him, still carry the weight of his daughter's judgment. The taste of regret was bitter in my mouth as I locked up the house and drove back to my own life, carrying my mother's letters like promises I wasn't sure I was strong enough to keep. The taste of inevitability was metallic and final as I waited in the empty Morrison Industries break room at 5:30 a.m., watching through the window for the familiar figure of my father approaching across the parking lot. 6 months of watching him arrive before dawn, 6 months of seeing him diminished and broken, and I'd finally worked up the courage for the conversation that would determine who we became to each other. Richard looked smaller in the janitor's uniform, older than his 53 years, carrying his cleaning supplies like a burden that weighed more than just physical materials. When he saw me sitting at the table where employees usually ate their lunches, his step faltered. We hadn't spoken directly since the day I'd handed him that uniform. "Elena," he said quietly, setting down his cart, "what are you doing here so early?" "We need to talk," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Really talk. Not as CEO and employee, not as judge and defendant, as father and daughter." He sat down heavily, his hands folded in his lap like a schoolchild called before the principal. In the harsh fluorescent light, I could see how much the past 6 months had aged him. New lines around his eyes, gray in his hair that hadn't been there before, a defeated slope to his shoulders that made him look fragile. "I've been thinking about Mom," I said, pulling out one of her letters. "About what she would think of what I've done to you, what I've done to myself." Richard's eyes fixed on the letter, recognition flickering across his features. "Where did you find that?" "Her bedroom. 17 letters, one for each birthday she thought she'd miss. She wrote them during her final months in the hospital." I smoothed the paper with trembling fingers. "She knew you'd hurt me. She tried to leave me tools to handle it, but you never gave them to me." "I didn't know about the letters," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wrote about forgiveness, about breaking cycles, about not letting other people's damage become your own." I looked up at him, this man who had shaped every insecurity I ever carried. She was trying to save me from becoming exactly what I became. "What you became," Richard repeated slowly, "is successful, powerful, everything I said you'd never be." "I became you," I said, echoing his words from months earlier. "The worst version of you, someone who uses power to diminish others, who mistakes cruelty for strength, and who can't tell the difference between justice and revenge."
The silence stretched between us, heavy with 29 years of accumulated damage. Outside the window, the city was beginning to wake up. Early commuters heading to jobs where they didn't have to face the wreckage of their family relationships. "I was wrong," Richard said finally, the words coming out like they physically hurt him. "About you, about your potential, about everything I said when you left. You proved me wrong in every possible way."
"And how does that feel?" I asked, knowing you were wrong. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Terrible," he admitted, "but not for the reasons you might think. I don't feel terrible because you succeeded. I feel terrible because I tried to destroy your confidence in yourself, and I almost succeeded. I feel terrible because I wasted 8 years being too proud to admit I was wrong, too scared to reach out to the daughter I missed every single day." The confession hit me like a physical blow. I had expected anger, defensiveness, more of the same arrogance that had driven me from home. I hadn't expected vulnerability, regret, or anything resembling genuine remorse. "You missed me?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "Every day," he said, tears forming in his eyes. "I'd drive past your old school, wondering if you graduated. I'd see articles about young entrepreneurs and wonder if one of them might be you. I'd pick up the phone to call you and put it down because I didn't know how to apologize for 26 years of being the wrong kind of father. So you said nothing." "I said nothing," he agreed. "And you built an empire out of spite for me, and I deserved every moment of humiliation you've put me through." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the company I'd bought for revenge, the building where I'd systematically destroyed my father's dignity over 6 months of calculated cruelty. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold that reminded me of my mother's voice, of the bedtime stories she used to tell about heroes who chose mercy over vengeance. "I bought this company to hurt you," I said without turning around. "I made you a janitor because I wanted you to feel powerless as you made me feel. I wanted you to understand that your opinion of my worth was meaningless." "I know," he said quietly. "But it's not meaningless, is it?" I turned to face him. "Your opinion still matters to me. That's why I needed to destroy you instead of just walking away. That's why watching you clean floors feels like victory and failure at the same time." Richard stood up slowly, moving to stand beside me at the window. For a moment, we looked out at the same view, two damaged people trying to figure out how to love each other despite the years of accumulated hurt. "What happens now?" he asked. I thought about my mother's letters, about Maya's warnings, about Marcus's wisdom about revenge being poison you drink yourself. I thought about the hollow feeling that had replaced the satisfaction I'd expected from victory. Now we try to figure out how to be father and daughter instead of victim and perpetrator. I don't know how to do that. I don't know if either of us knows how to do that. "We could learn," he offered hesitantly. "Maybe." I pulled out an envelope from my jacket pocket. "I wrote you a resignation letter. From the janitorial position, not from the company. You can go back to inventory coordination if you want it, or you can take a severance package and go somewhere else, start over where your daughter isn't your boss." He took the envelope but didn't open it. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to choose what makes you happy instead of what you think you deserve. I want you to stop punishing yourself for my childhood and start building something better for whatever time we have left." "And what about you? What are you going to do?" I looked around the break room where employees would soon arrive for another day of work, people whose lives I affected with every decision I made. The weight of responsibility felt different now, less like power and more like stewardship. I'm going to try to honor Mom's memory by becoming the woman she believed I could be, starting with letting go of the need to make you pay for the man you used to be. Richard opened the envelope and read the letter, his hands shaking slightly. "You're giving me my life back." "I'm giving us both our lives back," I corrected. "The question is what we're going to do with them." We stood there in the quiet break room as the sun rose over Morrison Industries, two people who had spent years hurting each other, trying to figure out how to stop. It wasn't forgiveness. That would take time, maybe years. but it was the beginning of something that looked like healing. And for now, that was enough. The taste of peace was something I'd never experienced before, sweet and light, like morning air after a storm has passed. 6 months later, I stood in the Morrison Industries boardroom, no longer as a conqueror, but as a leader who had chosen healing over vengeance. Richard worked in inventory coordination again, a relationship cautious but genuine. Maya smiled more often. The scholarship I'd established in my mother's name had already helped 12 students pursue their dreams. I'd finally learned the difference between proving my father wrong and proving myself right. The company thrived under leadership built on growth, not destruction. My mother's voice whispered in my memory, "Success isn't about proving other people wrong. It's about proving yourself right." I was finally free.